2.5 Admins, episode 244. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, your customary article plug, Alan, is robust and reliable backup solutions with OpenZFS.
Yeah, it was a little bit ago now, but it was World Backup Day just a couple of weeks ago. And so I wrote an article kind of talking about the things you need to consider when building a reliable backup system and how ZFS can let you do that for a lot less money than any other solution.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. Let's do some news. Synology confirms that higher-end NAS products will require its branded drives.
Well, welcome to the enshittification of hardware.
Yes, that gentle hissing you can hear, dear listener, is the steam pouring out of Alan's and my ears alike. There's not a whole lot of excuse for this, in my opinion. This is not a new tactic to Synology, requiring branded versions of third-party gear, and your device just refuses to work if it doesn't detect it's been blessed by the parent corporation. The first time that I ran into this directly, and it caused a big hitch in my own giddy-up, was I had a client who had purchased a small fleet of ThinkPad laptops. And said ThinkPad laptops, it turned out, were BIOS locked. If you did not get your Intel Wi-Fi chipset NIC from Lenovo, the laptop would refuse to boot. I discovered this because I had an issue with one of these laptops that had a bad NIC, and Lenovo support refused to acknowledge there was a bad NIC and kept saying, oh, it must be your router, despite the fact that we had 20 identical laptops, all of which were fine, except for this one. They were told that. They refused to acknowledge that. They just wanted to blame it on the router and get me off the phone and not have to send me a part. So I said, well, the hell with it. I know this is an Intel half-height, yada, 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 yada. I'll go buy the exact same thing and I will just replace it myself. And I did that. And the laptop's BIOS informed me I had inserted a third-party part and it would not boot until the offending part was removed. Now, keep in mind, we are actually talking about the exact same model number part from the same actual vendor. But this particular one of them had not been blessed by Lenovo, and therefore the ThinkPad said, no, I won't even boot until you get that out of me. I have also discovered that Lenovo ThinkPad servers, some of them require branded drives, just like what Synology is talking about. This does not mean that Lenovo made hard drives. It doesn't mean that Synology makes hard drives. It also doesn't just mean like, this is the compatibility list and this needs to be a drive from that list. No, it means this needs to be a part that you bought specifically from Synology in this case. And I cannot find anything positive to say about this. It's a naked cash grab.
I mean, if it was a case of these are the blessed drives, these are guaranteed to work, otherwise you're on your own, that'd kind of be fair enough. But to say that it's literally not going to work with drives that we haven't sold you, that's just bullshit.
Yeah, it's cash grab. And I'm sorry, but those drives, those Synology branded drives, you're not going to convince me that you're getting anything good out of that. I strongly doubt significant testing and validation has been done, or that any testing or validation that might be getting done is materially improving your odds of having a good experience with those drives. Again, this is a cash grab, man.
Yeah, well, even their quote here from the Synology representative is, quote, extensive internal testing has shown that drives that follow a rigorous validation process when paired with the Synology system are at less risk of drive failure and ongoing compatibility issues. I'm trying to think of the last time I had a compatibility issue with a SATA or SAS hard drive. The protocol's a standard.
Or an intermittent compatibility issue.
Yes.
Ongoing compatibility. It might stop being compatible next week if it's not Synology branded.
Well, the only thing that I'm thinking is SMR drives. They don't want you to put those in because you're just going to have a lot of problems with them.
Which, fair play, but in that case, you publish a model list, and you can say that one of the benefits of buying a Synology branded drive from them at typically about a 10% markup is that you're sure you won't get an SMR branded drive, and that might make it worthwhile for a lot of people to say, yeah, I'll go ahead and just unthinkingly spend an extra 10 to 15% to know that every single time I'm getting a drive on the compatibility list and I can't have made a mistake because I bought it from the company. All that is fair play, but when you say, no, the device will refuse to boot unless you've spent the extra money on the thing, buying it from this is what vendor lock-in is. This is why vendor lock-in is bad. This is why we avoid vendor lock-in, because once you're locked in, they can just say, give me more money, dick, because I have control over your business model. And they do, and you do.
Yeah, and I think the biggest problem I've seen with, like Jim was saying, like the Lenovo branded drives, which they inherited from IBM, and then the Synology ones here is it'll be the same thing as the drive from the manufacturer, because there's only 3 companies that make hard drives, right? Seagate, Western Digital, and Toshiba. So it's going to be one of those 3 with a different sticker on it. And while maybe when they first released the Synology version of an 8 terabyte drive, it'll be about the same price as the 8 terabyte drive from that vendor. When the vendors release the next, 30 terabyte drive and it pushes the price of all the other drives down, suddenly the Synology price doesn't get any less. And so you're literally paying even more money for an older hard drive because they're only going to produce so many of these Synology branded drives, and they want to get rid of all the old stock before they release the next bigger drives and so on. And so you're going to end up paying a lot more than just the little bit of premium they tend to add on to it. Suddenly it's a low volume thing, and so it doesn't see the same price drops when newer drives come out and so on.
It's a bit like what Apple used to do when they had Intel processors in their Macs. They'd release one and then just not update it for a couple of years and still charge the same price for it, even though it was a couple of generations old at this point.
There's an economy of scale. If you want to produce a machine as inexpensively as possible, you don't buy each part for each machine individually. You buy, entire warehouses full of this stuff, and then you assemble them. The downside of that is if you over-purchase, you can be left with a ton of stock from the older, presumably slower or not quite as good model that then you have to find something to do with it. And yeah, when you have a niche vendor, and even Apple in this case definitely qualifies as a niche vendor. I mean, sorry, Mac fans, but the Macintosh is definitely niche when it comes to desktop PCs, okay? And you used to see exactly that. You would see brand new Macs being sold with, frequently 3 or 4 year old Intel processors in them. And it's just that is the current model of Mac. And they don't update the model of Mac to a newer processor until that's what Apple decides it wants to do. You see the same thing pretty much anywhere where people are buying the same parts that you could theoretically buy yourself and then build them into a thing. The models are never using the newest, most bleeding edge parts. They're using what that company bought a ton of and will try to sell through all of their stock of before they update their model to the next year's whatever. As a small volume hardware OEM myself, I take the opposite approach. I try to avoid stockpiling parts because I don't want to get into that hassle. I usually charge the premium upfront right where you can see it. You're paying a little bit more money to get a machine that was designed and built by me. But, it's going to have, it's not going to be constrained by what I really needed to get out of a warehouse. It's going to be the right part today for the machine that you build today.
The CVE program came very close to being defunded, but then at the last minute, the US administration changed their mind. But it might be too late in terms of fragmentation within the industry.
Oh, I think it's definitely too late. We, and I mean the entire industry, kind of took the CVE for granted, as we do many things that appear ubiquitous, and we don't know anybody who's putting in the hard work, but it's right there for everybody to consume. We've all seen the XKCD cartoon, like internet infrastructure, and there's all these gigantic blocks being held up by a toothpick that's labeled like, one retired engineer who's been working on this since 1983. This is largely what we're looking at here. Nobody paid a whole lot of attention to CVE and MITRE, like in terms of just thinking about like, okay, why is this ubiquitous? Why do we all trust it? How does it get funded? Why is that important? How do we make sure that's secure? And because we didn't pay enough attention, it got attacked, and trust in it, I think, has irrevocably been destroyed. Now that the European Union is building a competitor, I don't think many people, even in the USA, are liable to continue looking to the one under U.S. jurisdiction rather than one that's a little bit more out in the open. We get yelled at a lot for politics, and I'm trying real hard not to be political about this, but in the open sense of open source, The EU administering something is still, government bureaucracy having its hands on it, but it's not as tightly integrated as a vertical stack as the United States government. Let me put it that way.
If you look at malware or hacking groups or anything else, you notice that they always have a giant list of names for the same thing. One research company calls it Fancy Bear, and another research company calls it a different name. Or, every different virus scanner's definition had a different name they came up with for one particular virus. And if we end up with that for CVEs, how do you tell if you have the patch for this one particular bug if every database and scanner program has a different name for the same bug? And that's where this whole idea of having a CVE that's common, and it's exactly the same across everything.
Yeah, common vulnerabilities and exposures.
Yeah.
Common.
Exactly. The idea is that we have this one globally unique ID that represents this one bug in all of the different places. And it knows which versions of software and which versions of operating systems have the patch and which don't, so that you can tell if you're vulnerable or not. So the EU NVD, European National Vulnerability Database, is a CVE issuer. So they are one of the places that's allowed to assign out new CVE numbers to things. But now they're saying, well, we're going to have to stand up our own database that isn't the CVE database, because the CVE database that's been run by MITRE for a long time announced that they had lost their funding. And then at the 11th hour, another 11 months of funding came in. But the damage has been done now, right? As soon as you threaten to shut something down, nobody can trust that it won't get shut down from now on. And so even if they guarantee the funding for the next 10 years or something, I still think the industry is going to move to something else. And we're already seeing the fragmentation. There's a separate global CVE initiative, although it's unclear if that's more than one person behind it. And then the people from the CVE group that get their funding via MITRE have started trying to stand up a nonprofit foundation to try to run it instead and maybe get funding more diversely. And then the EU is doing their thing, and other countries might do their own thing. And we're going to end up with 17 different vulnerability and exposure databases and try to coordinate a bunch of them together.
Everybody's seen the XKCD about standards and protocols, right?
Yep, just what I was thinking.
Oh boy, here we go back into the politics everybody hates. There are some things that are they're natural global monopolies, and we really kind of need global organizations to manage them that aren't in the pocket of any one country. Ideally, it would be great if something like this idea of a common vulnerability and exposures database was run by an international nonprofit with diverse funding that is getting funded by ideally every freaking country's government, just a little bit.
Maybe the UN, for example.
Exactly, so that no one country can just throw the whole thing in the can. I mean, ultimately, that's the reason that I don't think anybody is likely to trust the OG CVE much anymore, despite, renewing the funding to it. The damage has been done.
It's so funny. If this was a post on social media, we'd end it with, this is not about CVEs. Because it's just about America, isn't it? Let's face it. We can't trust you lot anymore. And even when he's gone, and even when things go back to normal, we're not going to properly trust you anymore.
That was where I was headed with this, is that I think that the real damage isn't even so much the lack of funding as much as the world is not just the USA. There are a lot of people across the world who do not trust the USA much at this point. And what this really did was just shine a glaring 50,000 lumen spotlight on the fact that, hey, the United States government has a lot of control over this thing. And it's that spotlight, I think, that was really the death knell. I think once too many people at exactly this particular phase of history had their noses rubbed in the fact that this extremely important international resource is potentially under the control of the United States government, I think that was it. I think that's enough for an awful lot of people to start looking for an alternative that is not potentially as directly controlled. And I don't think it's unfair. There are a lot of things that American citizens are like, well, I don't want something that's hosted in China, or, I don't want something that's hosted in Russia. I don't feel safe with this or that. Right now, I honestly, as an American, I feel safer with things under the EU's purview than most things, because again, the EU is not like just one country. I feel like it's by nature, at least right now, it represents a more diverse group of interests than any one country's government can. So like where you have to have something that basically looks like a federal bureaucracy overseeing things, I kind of prefer that one. Everybody feels differently, but nobody but a very certain subset of Americans thinks it's a good idea for America to have direct control over things anymore.
I think the biggest thing is, how do we not end up with 17 different agencies dealing with this? We've dealt with some of the US-centric stuff before, and it's not always gone well, right? Like when we moved control of domain names out from the US to ICANN, it turns out the system kind of captured itself a little bit there, and it's done a bunch of weird things like selling off new TLDs just to make money that weren't in anybody's interest, and so on. So if we do create a foundation to run this, or we do decide to let the EU run it or whatever, how do we make sure that it doesn't go off the rails in the future too? Like, how do we decide who are the stakeholders that get to decide how this is run? We could look at like the cybersecurity agencies from a whole bunch of different countries coming together and co-funding something to basically do what MITRE was doing, but with its funding being diverse from, the cybersecurity agencies of 30 different countries instead of one. But how do we keep that from deciding, that we're going to exclude some other country from this, or we're going to decide to charge money for access to the CVEs before a certain amount of time, and all kinds of terrible things that they could come up with. How do we make sure we have one system for cataloging and numbering these vulnerabilities, and that it's truly open, and that it doesn't get usurped in some weird way, like we've seen in the past?
I don't think we can make certain of that.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's necessary exactly, because the real answer is consensus. That's the only thing.
Yeah, but consensus from who?
From the people who actually use the CVE services. Those people have to have a consensus over who they want to trust. And once you throw it open, and once there are multiple competitors, I don't think it's likely that everybody's going to trust one or the other. However, the odds become pretty good. I think that at that point, maybe you boil things down into almost like a Cold War era, when you've got the U.S. bloc versus the Soviet bloc, and you wind up with duplication of services sometimes. Where if you're a NATO country, you're probably using one of these services over here, and if you're part of the Soviet or former Soviet, still on better terms with Russia than with the NATO countries, maybe instead you're adhering to these protocols or using these services over there. We saw a lot of that kind of balkanization then. Just given the way humans are, I don't know if we can really rely on getting it much tighter than 2 or 3 competitors. But I think by the time it's down to 2, I think that's manageable. I think at that point, a typical InfoSec person just keeps tabs, on their own preferred, database, and the exceptional ones keep tabs on both.
Yeah, it seems, how do we not end up with, a North American database, a European database, and an Asian database, and everybody else just gets left out and not in any database, and I have to track the numbers from 3 or 4 different authorities. Maybe I'm just too nostalgic for the days when this stuff was run by the geeks who actually should be doing it and not by the governments.
You're definitely going to end up with multiples. We have multiples now. Even with the CVE system live, as you yourself noted, there's a million different vendors calling the same thing a million different names. I don't think that ever goes away.
Right, but they all have the same CVE for it, and that's how you could tie them together.
Sure. You say that like it's something that has been true since the dawn of time, and sir, that is not correct.
No.
On human timescales, the whole CVE system is like brand new. The ink's still wet on it.
Sure, but on the internet's time scale, it's been there since very early, and it's a critical piece of infrastructure, and it's really shitty that it's going to go down in flames.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures. Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates. Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux. Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud. And Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. We had a message from Jay, who's a patron. I would like to hear your take on the FreeBSD quarterly update for 2025 Q2. Right now, we're about 2 weeks into the quarter, and quite a few packages in AMD 64 are still missing from package. XFCE, Calibra, Anki, etc. It appears to be either a problem with a package, WebKit GTK-X, or perhaps the build infrastructure. I've been running desktop FreeBSD for a few years, and this is the first time I've noticed such an interruption. I appreciate FreeBSD is largely community-driven, and these things happen from time to time.
In general, the way the quarterly packages work is there is basically a rolling release of packages on FreeBSD. It's basically just a Git repo of the 40,000 packages that are part of FreeBSD, and that gets updated constantly. Like every couple of minutes, there's a new commit. And then the quarterly branch is basically a snapshot of that created once every 3 months that is much more stable. In particular, the version of a program generally doesn't change. So it's a little bit more like the LTS you might expect from like a Ubuntu or something, where, if the version of Nginx is 1.2.3, it's going to stay that version plus maybe the security patches, but it's not going to randomly change to 1.5 that adds some new feature, but also deprecates something in your config file that messes you up. So the quarterly branch is basically a way to kind of protect yourself from the fact that otherwise, literally packages might change like every 3 days. There'd be more package upgrades. And in particular, there might be changes in there that are more breaking in that, an application moved from version X to version Y, and now it wants something different in its config file, or it has different dependencies or whatever. And it just means a lot more churn and can be especially problematic if you're trying to run something like a desktop rather than a server. But even, like I said, in the case of a server, like back in the day when Dovecot moved major versions and changed the whole config file, if you weren't ready for that, that was not fun. And so having that happen just anytime you run package upgrade would be bad. Whereas if you're on the quarterly branch, that's only going to happen on these big deltas once a quarter. And so it can save you a lot of hassle knowing that those things aren't going to change, and you can safely automatically upgrade all your packages to keep getting the security updates with knowing you're not going to randomly get a big version update that changes something. Normally, the quarterly set is there to protect you from the regular churn that happens as part of basically a rolling release of packages. However, in this particular case, there were some changes in FreeBSD itself to support 57-bit virtual addresses. So this is a feature in new forthcoming CPUs that allows them to have more virtual memory, using 57 of the 64 possible bits that the CPUs have to address memory. And so this is what's going to be required to allow systems to have 10 terabytes of RAM installed in them, instead of, I think the limit at the moment is like 6 terabytes. But this change happens to conflict with a couple of different programming languages, including Go, that use pointer tagging and use those upper bits to try to encode other information. And now that some of those higher bits in the address can actually be part of the address, it's causing some issues. And so this has caused a lot of packages not to build and causing a lot of fallout. It's also delayed the release of, I think, FreeBSD 14.3 that is expected to happen soon. And a bunch of the builds have been delayed because of all these breakages. So it is being dealt with, and I expect those changes to not affect the quarterly branch directly, but because the builders happen to run the latest version of FreeBSD, even if they're building an older version of FreeBSD, they were impacted by this. And so hopefully before too long, we will have a full set of the quarterly packages. A build for that happens every 2 or 3 days. It's just, it wasn't succeeding very well the last couple of days. But I expect things will be back to normal before too long. And the argument about what to do about this 57-bit address thing is going on in the Go community and other programming languages, and is, the fun you get when people make assumptions about hardware going to stay the same when hardware, in fact, does not stay the same. And the whole 64 bits of the pointer are really for the pointer. You can't just go sticking other things in there.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. QWERTY writes, you recently talked about your encrypted offsite backups and how you encrypt the data locally before sending it to the remote system. While I was listening, it got me thinking, those backups are useless if you lose the keys for them. So do they really count as an offsite backup without an offsite backup of the key? I'm guessing that in your particular case, the key is a password that you've memorized. That probably doesn't scale to the number of systems Jim and Alan manage. How do they handle the trade-off between having secure offsite backup and being able to recover from a disaster where all the local data was lost?
First off, I'm still not really using encrypted backups all that heavily because this is a very valid point. Encryption and backup are kind of on opposite sides of the same battle in a lot of ways. Encryption is like, no, you can't have this data unless you absolutely prove you're the right person to have it. Backup says, oh no, things went wrong. It's okay. Here's your data. You can have it. So there's a little bit of a conflict there. And personally, I don't have that issue because I'm not doing any of my own remote encrypted backups. And for the clients that do, well, that's a client by client thing. It's not one centralized thing I do for all my clients. For the most part, I'm backing up onto hardware that I physically control, so I'm not as concerned about the encryption at rest part of it. If I were, however, probably what I would be looking at doing is putting a copy of all of the relevant keys in a vault, along the lines of like a KeyPass credential vault, and then you back that thing up. Now, basically, at the end of the day, the only thing that you need to keep up with is the key to that KeyPass vault.
Yeah. So first I would say that's more of a feature than a bug. The fact that I can destroy all of my remote backups, even if I don't control where they are, by just destroying the key, that's a feature. But it is also a danger. And so, yeah, my solution is those passwords go in my password manager with other things. And my password manager happens to support, certain keys you have to do additional steps to get access to. Rather than just unlocking the vault, you also have to do an extra 2FA type thing to get access to some of the even more sensitive keys. But yeah, in general, the ability to turn the offsite backup into a paperweight by destroying that key is a feature as well, where you want to make sure that nobody can read that backup because I don't want them to. If they don't have this key, it's not for them. But talking to Colin Percival, who runs an online backup service that does encryption on your computer before it sends it to the backup, he gets lots of people being like, well, you can reset my password, right? It's like, no, that's not how this works. And that's by design. So yeah, it is still a backup, but it turns out that you're not paying to have a backup, you're paying to be able to restore it. And so having a good procedure for that is important. For Tarsnap, they provide the ability to basically print out your key by base64 encoding it and turning it in basically letters and numbers and printing out a big page of it that you would laboriously have to type back in if you needed to recover from it.
Like an old school BASIC game.
OCR, you Luddites.
Yeah, if you use a nice font, I suppose. Like, I'm sure they could manage to do it as a QR code, but those didn't exist when Tarsnap started. But it's, again, the kind of thing you meant to like put in a safe deposit box or somewhere. So you want to back up that key, but not in the same place that you back up the backup, because you don't want those two things to ever come together except for when you're bringing them together to do the restore.
Safe deposit box is where I was headed, talking about the KeyPass thing. Once you've got it narrowed down to where like, okay, there's one key that I need to get all the other keys, your backup strategy is a little bit different for that, because now you want a backup in the clear in as many places as you can manage of the actual credential vault, which is encrypted and does no good to anybody unless you can get into it. You don't want the backup of your credential vault to be inside the encrypted backup of your pool. So you kind of need to have a separate system for the actual vault. And as far as the key to get into the vault, like Alan said, a safe deposit box is exactly the kind of way that you want to back that up, should you need to back up that kind of credential, because it's all going to be about physical security and access control when it comes to that master key that unlocks all your other keys. And you probably aren't going to have a better answer for being able to physically secure a small secret like that and have ironclad access control than your bank can offer you. So safe deposit box, print it out, stick it in the bank, done. And like I said, make sure that there's a copy of your actual credential vault in the clear in several places. I've mentioned already, I use KeyPass, so I keep a copy of it on my Google Drive. That's actually the primary access for it is via Google Drive. But even if somebody hacks my Gmail, not going to do them any good because they don't have the key to open that vault.
Yeah, in particular, the vault is going to change frequently every time I add a new website. So I don't want to keep a copy of the vault in the safe deposit box because that'll be a pain to update all the time. But by using the right encryption, Yeah, exactly. I can have the vault out in the clear and have like 18 copies of it everywhere is convenient. But in order to access any of those, you need this master key that is stored in there. Do remember that banks keep bankers' hours. If it's something you might need on a Saturday and not be able to wait till Monday, maybe a safe deposit box isn't the right answer.
On the other hand, if you need to go to a safety deposit box to get into your own credential vault that you use on a regular basis, which you really ought to, you are using a credential vault on a daily basis, right? If you need to get into a safety deposit box to get into it, you're doing it pretty badly wrong, because it's kind of the whole point of the vault is it gets you access to all the things and you only have to keep up with the one secret. So memorize that thing, man.
Well, I'm saying a little bit more of a business disaster recovery scenario where maybe not everyone keeps a copy of the super secret key in their personal vault.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send in your questions or your feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.